Hey guys, welcome back to another Central London Shorts video or episode, whatever you want to call it. Today we're going to discuss what shoes should I wear and why. And when I say what shoes should I wear and why, what I'm referring to specifically is weightlifting shoes. So shoes with a heel on the bottom that I will go into in a little bit, just to sort of like explain what they're for, why you'd use them. So before, you first need to ask yourself, uh, you know, how much benefit they're going to give you, and why you need them before you splash out on weightlifting shoes. Because let's be honest, if you haven't considered these, they are quite a bit of money for a shoe. And there's a few key concepts that, which I'll delve into a little bit more detail later, that are required outside of weightlifting that we might use the shoes for. And these are balance, mobility, and stability. And I'm not saying that the shoes will give you that specifically. What I'm saying is that they might aid in it. So compared to a normal shoe, weightlifting shoes are usually heavier, with a flat sole and usually some sort of midfoot strap just to keep the foot securely in place. And weightlifting shoes have a raised heel. Usually you'll find most weightlifting shoes will be between 0.5 of an inch to 1 inch. I'm not sure if I've ever seen a shoe which is slightly more than an inch, but they're usually made of hard, non-compressive material, things like plastic or something like that. Historically, though, the heels were made of wood, and they were actually nailed into the bottom of the shoe. Don't ask me why that was the case, but yeah. And this has generally been supplemented now, like I just said, of some sort of hard plastic. And mainly this is for cost and for weight saving. They weigh a lot less, even though some shoes are a lot heavier, but they also cost less to manufacture. And before we go into how they can help and why, I just want to take us back into the reason that they were developed in the first place and how. So the history of weightlifting shoes dates back to around the 1960s, where at this point, some lifters adopted the split stance of lifting. You might have seen it in the old videos. And if you want some examples after this video, if you just Google athletes like John Davies, Norbert Shiminsky, the Soviet Rudolf Pluckfelder, and even the Paul Irenash, Palinsky, those sorts of people were sort of like famous for doing the split style of lifting, where you start on 2 feet and then you're just going to split your feet either side, like you might see in a split jerk, for example. That's how they would usually catch it, but it was a lot deeper. Prior to this, footwear mattered very little, as evidenced by the shoes of many lifters from between the 1920s to the 1950s, up until the point that the shoes were developed into actual weightlifting shoes. And these people tended to wear kind of just normal shoes, or like boxing shoes, something that had a flat and a hard heel. And usually these adopted the styles of what's called the splot method, to gain an advantage of moving under the barbell. Again, if you don't know what the splot method is, if you just Google that, essentially it's, I guess it's like a mixture of like a power slash split. I'd say the best common example of seeing a kind of splot method would be someone like CJ Cummings when he used to do his old sort of power jerk style. That's kind of like the splot method. As more and more lifters began adopting the split position, it became apparent that run-of-the-mill sneakers would no longer, or shoes, I can't believe I said sneakers, I'm not even American, so, shoes would no longer do. Soon after, weightlifters realized that shoes with a raised heel were needed to permit the back foot to flex so that the heel could be raised, while at the same time allowing the ankle joint of the front foot to bend further over the toes, whilst keeping the heel on the ground. During this period, another method began to take traction, and that was the squat technique, which is what we all commonly see nowadays. It's just a normal bilateral shuffle the feet out, catch in a squat, and that transformed the weightlifting shoe, well, until popularized it to what it is today. It was actually popularized by two American brothers, Pete and Jim George, were the guys who kind of first donned the squat technique, and soon that kind of that technique sort of debuted onto weightlifting platforms around the world. And this has had a significant impact regarding weightlifting shoes, like I just suggested. And lifters kind of experimented with things like work boots, boxing shoes, all that sort of stuff to kind of get a little bit of a heel. But it wasn't until the Soviet lifters decided to nail raised heels to the bottom of leather soles. So you'd have the shoe with a leather sole, you'd nail a piece of plank of wood to the bottom of the shoe, and yeah, it would obviously be nailed to the bottom of the shoe, meaning that there'd be a slight incline on the shoe. The fit would obviously look flat on the bottom, but the shoe would be doing this. And that changed the design of the shoe, obviously, altogether. Now, importantly, Soviet shoes were not boots in the style that others might have been using. In the 1960s, we saw emergence of things like York, Puma, Karoo, and Tiger weightlifting boots, some of which are still around. You might be able to find some on eBay, etc. And these were all inspired by the Soviet design. And while such shoes did prove popular, it wasn't until the late 60s that Adidas kind of changed the game with weightlifting shoes. And it was sort of like the Western answer to, I guess, the footwear conundrum. Initially, it was obviously inspired by the high tops with the rubber soles, and then you'd have the bit nailed to the bottom. Now, Adidas, they took the idea and they thought, okay, well, how can we make this better? How can we make it, slightly lighter and etc. And it wasn't until kind of the 1970s when a guy called Tom Kono, one of the era's most successful Olympic lifters in the 1970s back then, began working with Adidas to design shoes that were suitable for weightlifting. And what they kind of discovered was, rather than having this whole boot thing, they took rid of that, and it was just a normal shoe with a raised heel that was actually connected to the actual shoe itself rather than being nailed onto the bottom. Anyway, after all that spiel, you guys can find out loads of information online about where the shoes come from. Let's get back to the task at hand. First of all, we're going to target why are they useful. The main benefit of the weightlifting shoe is improved mechanical angles at the bottom of a squat position. Due to the raised heel in your ankle has to perform less dorsiflexion, which is essentially like your shin coming towards your shoelaces to reach the bottom of your squat. So it's allowing the knee to come further forwards over the toes, essentially. Don't confuse this with making dorsiflexion easier. It actually just reduces the demand for flexion due to the change in the angle. That's important to know, is that most people will buy weightlifting shoes because they think that it's going to make their dorsiflexion better, but it's still something that needs to be worked on outside of the shoe if you want to actually improve that. It does change the demand, so obviously it will make it a little bit easier, but that's like plugging a gone hole with a plaster. It's only going to fix the problem until it rises again. So it's, they're great, but if ankle mobility is your issue, weightlifting shoes will help to a degree, but you need to address where the issue is actually coming from. Along with that, the weight, the density, and the flatness of the shoe increases stability, making you feel more locked in and cemented to the ground. And lastly is balance, and probably the most important. So the Chinese weightlifting team talk about balance as the most important aspect of weightlifting. Balance this, balance that, balance through the whole movement. And it starts from, well, you guessed it, it starts from the feet. Balance always starts from the feet. Although I've not come across many studies examining the aspect of balance, aside from the classic Garhammer study in the 1980s, I could probably put a link in the description if you guys are interested in reading. Essentially what it says is that the pressure during weightlifting movements mainly stays in the midfoot, which is basically the ball of the foot. And without going into too much detail, throughout the pull, it shifts slightly forwards and slightly backwards, depending on the positions that you find yourself in: first pull, transition, receive, etc. Now, interestingly, another novel paper, albeit they did only have 4 participants, and again, I could put that in the description if you guys want to read that. But interestingly, the researchers concluded that not only does the center of pressure move forwards and backwards, but it also moves laterally across the structure of the foot. So obviously, if you've got a flat, wide sole on a weightlifting shoe, lateral action of weight going outside the ball of the foot is going to be really important to try and keep that weight closer to the center. And that's one of the reasons why they're so useful compared to lifting in, say, trainers. So that's kind of the why, like, I guess, what it does. Now, why should they be considered a useful tool? Well, that's exactly it. They're a tool. They're not a means to an end. So if mobility is an issue or if balance is an issue, yes, to some degree, weightlifting shoes will solve that issue, but you need to look at where the root cause is happening. Is the balance coming from, you're losing balance because you're not able to keep tension in your back, so the bar is pulling you forwards? Or is it because, your feet are all over the place and you can't grip the ground, etc.? So it's a useful tool and it should be used as such. It's very easy for that tool to turn into a harmful crutch if you're not careful about how and when you deploy it. First, before you consider weightlifting shoes, you should be able to squat and squat well. If you are still learning to squat, there is some important proprioceptive feedback that a thick and incompressible shoe might mask. And I'm talking specifically in the shoe up into the lower limbs. More importantly, using a lifting shoe to overcome the lack of ability to squat due to some sort of flexibility or mobility issue, like I was alluding to, amounts to pushing the problem down the line that you'll pay for at some point. So if this is your situation, your first priority should be to fix what Kelly Starrett calls it something like an open circuit, which is essentially a lack of understanding, experience, or proprioception, and then a closed circuit fault, which is essentially like mobility, flexibility, or any other joint restriction. So what you need to try and do is figure out an open circuit. So figure out what it's doing, what your feet are doing, how you can feel it, and then you need to address things like joint and tissue restrictions and mobility and flexibility through the ankle, through the hip, whatever it might be, before you rely on a 200+ pound shoe to save you. If you can already squat well, it's worthwhile to use your lifting shoes sparingly. And the reason for doing so, to have a reason for doing so. Most slow lifts, and I'm referring to like a squat, a deadlift, or a press, might be slightly easier with a lifting shoe. But if you aren't a competitive weightlifter, the trade-off of less time spent in deep and full ankle dorsiflexion probably isn't worth it, if I'm honest. For the fast lifts, for example, snatch, clean and jerk, etc., lifting shoes can be invaluable. Obviously, going through the sort of checkpoints that we just went through and identify whether you actually need them, as they allow you to catch with stability and authority in challenging positions, and like I suggested, keeping balance through the pull. And obviously that can potentially save you from overcompensating other joints to save a lift, like your knees or your back or whatever it might be. And this is far more important in full versions of the lift. Obviously, like cleans and power cleans, it's probably not so prevalent to be able to use them. So I guess this begs the question, well, which shoe should I buy then? Well, this honestly, this is where it kind of comes down to personal preference. Some shoes, like I explained at the beginning of this long-winded lecture about shoes that no one probably actually cares about, have different heel height and width, as well as weight and the design. And honestly, without looking into EMG, center of pressure, or force data to determine whether a 0.75 inch or a 1 inch heel is better, I'll save you the hassle and I'll tell you that the difference is marginal, very marginal. And like I said, choosing a shoe for you, if you've already gone through all of the things that you've decided, okay, I need shoes, it comes down to personal preference, and most importantly, what feels comfortable on your foot and what feels comfortable when you're lifting. So I'd suggest if you do go to a shop that sells weightlifting shoes, try them on. And I know this might look silly, but try them on when you're going through the motions so you can feel what it's supposed to feel like in your foot. I hope that you guys took something from this short video. Oh, I say short, but it wasn't that short. about shoes. If you guys have got any questions, feel free to send us an email at Central London Weightlifting. It will be down in the description, as well as our Instagram. Thank you for tuning in for another Central London Weightlifting short, and we will catch you in the next episode.